Standardization is a huge issue. I have worked with that concept in set-top box data. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of standardization and perhaps some of your opinions about best practices?
Okay, I think they're actually two separate things, standardization and best practices. But I will tell you a quick story about EDI or e-business and standardization. So since the mid-'80s, when the very first electronic documents were written for the broadcast industry, really the whole advertising media industry, I've been involved in both writing the standards and getting people to use the standards. What the great misunderstanding is that people in the media business, not in the systems business, think that you can just produce an electronic document of some kind. Could be an ANSI. If you know what that means, and you've been in the business a long time now, people talk about XML. Those are formatting tools. The most important thing is for the trading partners to agree on what the business process is. You cannot write an e-business system and the documents that make that system work unless you agree on the business process. So there's the most extensive product in the market is called DARE, and that allows spot television buyers and sellers to talk to each other. It's used by rep firms, TV rep firms, and broadcasters. There's versions of it that have been adopted for radio. We're working on versions now for other media. It started with vendors representing the largest buyers and sellers sitting in a room for weeks, and agreeing what the business process could be based on what their systems could do, and then going back to their clients and vetting that with the clients to make sure it would work for them. All of that, it took over 10 years for those products to actually be developed enough within the individual applications on both sides to start to get the traction that it has today, which is, something north of 5 million transactions a year that go through that system. So that was a long way of saying that standardization starts with the trading partners agreeing how to work, how to trade, the nuances of every single, if you're going to make something a system, you have to cover every single possible exception, nuance. And all that stuff has to be coded by all of the vendors that represent all the trading partners, and then slowly momentum starts to build. I have some information on electronic invoices in the broadcast business. DDS has processed each of the last 3 years more than $30 billion of electronic invoices for broadcast. It took 20 years to get to that. The first electronic invoice went between a buyer and a seller and a buyer in 1989. There's just so many details to actually make these things work. If you don't have standards, you can't even start. And we have I'm sorry to go on so long, but we have a great initiative with the IAB that the 4A's is now joining about defining an invoice for digital display. Listen to my words, defining an invoice, not the electronic invoice, because first you have to start with agreeing what has to be on the piece of paper. If you agree what's on the piece of paper, all of us vendors can make this work pretty easily today in terms of an electronic document. And I can't tell you how it's being applauded by the largest publishers going, this is what we've been waiting for. Otherwise, every agency, every large publisher is sending every agency a different looking digital invoice. If we kept down that road, we will end up where print is today. And it is impossible to turn print invoices electronic because every single publisher has their own system. I'm talking about magazine and newspaper publishers and their rep firms. Every single invoice looks different. If we go down that road in digital, we're never going to get to where we are in broadcast, the success of broadcast.
So you had mentioned that there's a difference between standards and best practices. Can you talk a little bit about the difference and what you think are best practices?
Okay, that's right. I did not fully answer that question. So, of course, I said the first thing in building an e-business system around one of the transaction sets, it could be orders, it could be proposals, it could be invoices. Those are the three main pieces, and then traffic instructions are in there. And that's the thing that makes our industry go. Those four big transaction sets. A standard is an agreed upon who's going to send what to whom. I'm just going to give you a simple example. In the spot television and radio world, the order is generated by the agency. There's negotiation or for proposals or for prior orders, but the actual order is generated by the agency. In the network world, it's the exact opposite. There's still a negotiation that goes on, but the actual order that has all of the individual units, the demographic data attached to those, the final programming, is generated by the network. So you have to have agreement on that type of business process before you can even write any kind of a system around it, let alone an e-business system. Within the that structure, I think you actually have to have room for lots of practices. And if you look at the cable network world, just look at the different kinds of genres that are there. So sports networks are going to have a very different way of having their best practices with buyers than, let's say, children's networks. Therefore, the business process per end standard needs to be broad enough that you can have really individual best practices that suits that particular buyer and seller. And trading partners are of different sizes. So you might have a small network that's just gotten rated, highly targeted. Maybe it's one of those super news networks like it's CNBC or Bloomberg or something like that, and they almost have a built-in targeting audience. But the way the buyer and seller are going to work within the overall standard is going to be the best practice around that is going to be different. Maybe they'll agree that there's a certain kind of research report that's part of the posting that will be provided after the fact. You get to one of the really broad networks, certainly the ABCs, the NBCs, Foxes, etc., CBS, and the USAs and the higher rated cable networks, they're going to have a different kind of best practice. When you say best practice, to me, I do immediately think about my agency clients, because they are always working with us to make sure they can bring the most efficient practices, effective practices, to their own organization. And if you look at how the consolidations have gone in the last 10 years, and even the consolidations within the holding companies, they're almost always a result of them implementing a best practice within their organizations. So maybe the fact that TV and radio are bought by the same buyer today would be the ultimate, that's a best practice for those agencies that do that, because they have the scale to do it. So I don't think there is one best practice. I think different different sizes for different, what's the right phrase there?
Different for different parts of the business?
Yeah, but one size does not fit all. Right. And the systems have to be flexible enough to do that. If they're not flexible enough, you're not going to have a big enough market. So